This is a continuation of the Chapter 1 lecture beginning with Slide 1, Part B. In Part B, we start to explore the language of anatomy. And whenever you learn your orientational terms, your directional terms, also the regions of the body, you need to reference these in regard to anatomical position. In Slide 2, we can see what the anatomical position is. The body is erect, feet are slightly apart, palms facing forward, or we know that's palms facing anteriorly, and the thumbs are pointing away from the body, or laterally. The directional terms you need to know are in Table 1.1, and I've presented these with their opposites together. So you can see superior and inferior are opposites. Superior is toward the head, inferior away from the head. Anterior toward the front. We can also use the word ventral to describe anterior. Posterior toward the back of the body, or we can use the word dorsal to describe posterior. Medial is toward the midline of the body. Lateral is away from the midline of the body. And somewhere in between, medial and lateral would be intermediate. Proximal is closer to the origin of the body. Distal is farther away from the origin of the body. Superficial is toward the surface of the body, and deep is away from the surface of the body. In Slides 5 and 6, you'll notice some examples that are used to help you to understand these directional terms. For example, the head is superior to the abdomen, or the navel is inferior to the chin. Please learn Table 1.1 for your first test. You'll need to be able to define the terms as well as know some examples of each term. In Slide 7, we start to explore regional terms. The scientific term is presented and its common term is also applied as well. The common term will be useful in learning these terms, but you will be responsible for the proper scientific anatomical term when labeling these figures on your test. So let me just pronounce some of the anterior regional terms. Nasal, oral, cervical, acromial, axillary, abdominal, brachial, antecubital, antebrachial, pelvic, carpal, pollex, palmar, digital, pubic, patellar, crural, pedal, tarsal, digital. Now starting on the right side, frontal, orbital, buccal, mental, sternal, thoracic, mammary, umbilical, coxal, inguinal, femoral, fibular, and hallux. The posterior terms that you need to know you can see on slides 10, 11, and 12, and include cephalic, manus, otic, occipital, acromial, vertebral, scapular, brachial, dorsal, olecramal, lumbar, sacral, gluteal, perineal, femoral, popliteal, sural, calcaneal, plantar. You also need to be aware of the body planes. The different planes include sagittal, which divides the body into right and left parts. If the plane divides the body into equal parts, right and left halves, it's a mid-sagittal or medial plane. If it is slightly off-center, it is a parasagittal plane. A frontal or coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior parts, or dorsal and ventral parts. A transverse or horizontal, commonly known as a cross-section, divides the body into superior and inferior parts. And an oblique section would be cuts made diagonally to a midline. In slide 14, you can see the illustration of the body planes. Please be aware of the body planes when you're studying for your Chapter 1 test. You should also study this figure as well. You also need to have an understanding that there is anatomical variability. This becomes more important when we start to look at some of the muscles, and it becomes really important in anatomy too, when you start to learn vessels. It's also important when we start to learn the different types of nerves, because there might be some deviation between what you see in your textbook versus the samples you might dissect, because nerves and blood vessels may be somewhat out of place. Also, there are certain muscles and tendons that might be missing in certain specimens. In slide 16, we start to learn about the body cavities. The human body is divided into two main cavities, the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. The dorsal cavity is located posteriorly, and it's going to protect the nervous system. The ventral cavity is located more anteriorly. If you look at slide 17, the dorsal cavity is pictured in yellow. The ventral cavity is illustrated with red. The dorsal cavity is subdivided into the cranial cavity, and that encases the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which contains the spinal cord. The ventral body cavity is divided into the thoracic cavity, which contains the heart and lungs, and the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity is separated by a dome-shaped muscle we call the diaphragm. In slide 18, you can see that the ventral cavities are subdivided even more. The thoracic cavity is divided into two pleural cavities, which house the lungs. There's also a central mediastinum. Within the mediastinum is the pericardial cavity, which encases the heart. There's also a superior mediastinum. The abdominopelvic cavity, as the name implies, can be subdivided into the abdominal cavity, which contains the digestive viscera, and the pelvic cavity, which contains reproductive organs, bladder and rectum. Please be aware of your body cavities and be able to label these cavities. As noted previously in the figure, body cavities can be divided into two main areas, the dorsal and the ventral body cavities. Thoracic cavity is a portion of the ventral body cavities and can be divided into pleural cavities and the mediastinum. The abdominopelvic cavity is also part of the ventral body cavities and is composed of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. These two are separated by the dome-shaped muscle that we call the diaphragm. The ventral body cavities do encase many important organs. The ventral body cavity has a double-layer membrane, and we call this serosa. The layer around the internal organs themselves is the visceral serosa, and the layer lining the body cavity is the parietal serosa. In between these two layers is fluid, and we call this serous fluid. If you look at slide 22, this is an illustration of how you can think about the differences between visceral and parietal layers. Again, the visceral serosa always surrounds the organ itself. So your fist represents the organ, and the outer portion of the balloon represents the cavity. So the outer portion of the balloon is comparable to the parietal serosa, and the lining around your fist is comparable to the visceral serosa, and the air between the two layers is comparable to the serous fluid. Slide 23, you can see an actual example of the heart, which rests in the pericardial cavity. The layer around the heart is known as the visceral pericardium. The layer that lines the body cavity is the parietal pericardium. And in between, we have the fluid. This fluid is needed so the two layers don't rub together. And there is a common occurrence in the lungs where the visceral pleura and parietal pleura rub together, and when they do, that's known as pleurisy. These are some of the other body cavities that you need to be aware of, but you are not required to label on your test. We've got the oral and digestive cavity, the nasal cavity, orbital, which houses the eyes, the middle ear, and synovial. You can see the orbital cavity where the eyes sit, the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the middle ear. You also have an opening there. And in between bones that articulate, you have a synovial cavity. In slide 26, we start to look at the abdominopelvic regions. There are 9 regions. You do need to be able to label these regions. Umbilical would be right in the center, where remnants of the umbilicus is. In other words, your belly button. Above that, epigastric means above the stomach. Below that, hypogastric means below the stomach. You can also see there's an iliac region, right and left. You can remember this because that part of your hip bone that sticks out is called the iliac crest. You also need to know about the right and left lumbar regions. So this would be the loin areas, and also the right and left hypochondriac regions. The word Chon means cartilage, so it looks like it rests near the lungs. Your ribs are held together by costal cartilage, so maybe that can be a trigger to remember the right and left hypochondriac region. So sitting slightly below the cartilage is what it means. In slide 27, you need to be aware of where the organs rest within the abdominopelvic regions. So you do need to know where the organs are placed in reference to the 9 abdominopelvic regions. And in slide 28, you need to also be able to label the 4 quadrants of the abdominopelvic area. So there's the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. This concludes the lecture for Chapter 1. Thank you.